Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want you to take a deep breath, dim the lights, and settle into your favorite chair, or pull the covers up just a little bit higher. We are going to embark on a journey that is intentionally, almost aggressively unexciting. We're going to talk about the Qing Dynasty, but we aren't looking at palace coups or grand battles. Instead, we're drifting into the soft, gray world of the salt trade and the endless, beautiful paperwork of the salt permits. It's the kind of history that feels like a warm, heavy blanket. So just relax, let my voice become a background hum, and let's get into the granular details of 18th century Chinese resource management. To understand the sheer, soul-crushing scale of the Qing Salt Administration, we first have to understand that in the 1700s, salt wasn't just something you sprinkled on a potato. It was the lifeblood of the imperial treasury. It was the oil of the pre-industrial world. And because it was so valuable, the emperor, in his infinite wisdom and desire for a very balanced checkbook, decided that no one could just go out and buy salt like a normal person. No, that would be far too simple. Instead, the state created a system of permits so complex it would make a modern tax attorney weep with joy. Let's float over to the Lianghuai region. This was the crown jewel of salt production, a place where the air smelled faintly of brine and the sound of scratching quills never truly stopped. If you wanted to be a salt merchant here, you didn't just need money, you needed a pedigree and a very specific piece of paper called a yin. Now, the yin wasn't just a permit, it was a golden ticket, a hereditary right to be part of the most lucrative and yet most boring monopoly in the history of the world. The merchants who held these permits were essentially the tech billionaires of their day. But instead of coding apps, they were obsessing over the precise weight of salt crystals and the humidity levels in stone warehouses. They lived in Yangzhou, a city that became a playground for the wealthy and the weary. But even with all their gold and their private gardens, they were still slaves to the permit. Every single bag of salt had to be tracked, logged and stamped by a mid-level bureaucrat who likely hadn't seen the sun in 3 weeks. The paperwork trail for a single shipment of salt from the coastal vats to the inland markets was longer than the actual journey. First, there was the certificate of origin. This had to be signed in triplicate by the local salt inspector, a man whose entire career was dedicated to ensuring that no one was sneaking an extra handful of salt into the official bags, because, of course, the state cared about that extra handful. Every grain was a copper coin for the emperor's pocket, and the emperor had a lot of pockets to fill. Once the salt was bagged and the first set of permits was issued, the shipment began its slow, agonizingly peaceful crawl down the Grand Canal. But it couldn't just sail through. Oh no, there were checkpoints, so many checkpoints. At each station, a new official would emerge from a small wooden hut blinking in the daylight to compare the physical bags against the ink on the scrolls. If the ink was smudged or if the merchant's seal looked a bit tired, the whole shipment stayed put. It was a world governed by the slow drying of ink and the precise folding of mulberry paper. The bureaucrats themselves were a fascinating breed of exhausted scholars. To get these jobs, they had to pass the grueling imperial examinations, memorizing thousands of lines of Confucius, only to spend the next 40 years counting bags of salt in a damp office near a canal. You can almost feel their boredom radiating through the centuries. They would sit at their desks, sipping lukewarm tea and carefully recording the movement of permit number 482B from the regional office to the sub-district office. It was a cycle of administrative repetition that kept the entire empire afloat, one slow brushstroke at a time. And then we have the salt vats themselves. Imagine a landscape of shimmering white ponds stretching toward the horizon. The workers here didn't move quickly. Speed leads to spills, and spills lead to more paperwork. They moved with a rhythmic, hypnotic, slow-motion grace, raking the salt into neat, conical piles that looked like tiny frozen mountains. Each pile had to be measured against a standard wooden box, and the results were, you guessed it, written down on a ledger that would eventually be archived in a room filled with 10,000 other ledgers. The irony of the Lianghuai salt trade was that for all the wealth it generated, the actual process was as exciting as watching moss grow on a damp stone. But for the Qing state, this was perfection, a predictable, slow, and heavily documented flow of revenue. They didn't want innovation. They didn't want excitement. They wanted a world where every grain of salt was accounted for by a man with a very sharp brush and a very large stack of paper. As we move deeper into the logistics, we see the head merchant system. These were the guys responsible for making sure the other merchants didn't get too creative with their accounting. They were the hall monitors of the salt world. If a shipment was missing or a permit was forged, the head merchant was the one who had to explain it to the Governor General. And the Governor General was usually a man who had very little patience for excuses, but a great deal of patience for long, rambling reports about transport costs. The transport costs themselves were a masterpiece of mundane detail. There were fees for the boatmen, fees for the porters, fees for the guards who watched the salt to make sure no one seasoned their dinner with imperial property, and, of course, the customary gifts for the officials at the locks. These weren't bribes officially. They were just, let's call them, lubricants for the wheels of bureaucracy. Every single one of these transactions had to be noted, categorized, and filed. The ledger for a single merchant house for a single year could easily weigh as much as a small dog. Let's pause for a moment and think about the ink. The Qing bureaucracy consumed oceans of ink. The inkstones were rubbed, the brushes were dipped, and the records grew. There were records for the production of salt, the storage of salt, the transport of salt, the sale of salt, and even records for the records themselves. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem of calligraphy. If you were a fly on the wall in a Qing salt office, the only thing you'd hear would be the soft shh of paper being turned, and the occasional heavy sigh of a man who realized he'd misplaced a decimal point in the 1742 autumn report. The beauty of this system, if we can call it that, was its sheer resilience. It didn't matter if the emperor was a genius or a recluse, the salt permits kept moving. The bureaucracy was a machine made of people and paper, grinding away with a low, constant hum. It provided a sense of stability that was almost rhythmic. As long as the salt was being weighed and the permits were being stamped, the world felt orderly. The sun rose, the brine evaporated, and the ink flowed. Consider the physical permits themselves. They were often quite large, printed with intricate wood block designs to prevent counterfeiting, though people tried because why not double down on the risk of execution for a little extra salt money? The paper was thick and fibrous, and over time it would absorb the smell of the offices, a mix of old wood, stagnant canal water, and the faint, sharp scent of charcoal smoke. Holding one of these permits today is like holding a piece of 18th century silence. I want you to imagine one particular official. Let's call him Clerk Zhao. Zhao has been working in the Yangzhou salt office for 22 years. He's an expert in the permit verification for secondary inland waterways. His world is 4 inches wide, the width of the columns in his ledger. He doesn't care about the wars in the north or the European traders in the south. He cares about the fact that Merchant Wang's signature on Permit 709 looks slightly more hurried than it did last Tuesday. Zhao will spend 3 hours comparing the 2 signatures, not because he's a hero of the state, but because the alternative is to face the vast, terrifying emptiness of a day with no paperwork. This is the heartbeat of history, not the shouting, but the scratching of the pen. Not the fire, but the slow, cool drying of the brine. The salt trade was a massive, slow-moving glacier of human effort, leaving behind a moraine of documentation that tells us more about the human soul's capacity for boredom than any epic poem ever could. And as the salt boats drifted down the canal, their wooden hulls creaking softly against the water, the merchants on board would often spend their time writing poetry. Because when you're involved in a trade this dull, your mind has no choice but to wander into the clouds. They wrote about the moon reflecting in the salt pans, or the way the mist clung to the willow trees, all while clutching their precious stamped permits in their silk sleeves. It was a life of extreme luxury, built on a foundation of extreme monotony. Chapter 2. The soft monotony of the imperial laundry. The transition from the salt pans to the inner sanctum of the Forbidden City brings us to a place that was, surprisingly, even more obsessed with tiny details and even less concerned with the passage of actual time. We are entering the world of the Palace Laundry Service, a department where the stakes were technically high. One doesn't simply lose the emperor's favorite silk undershirt, but the daily reality was a long, damp stretch of lukewarm water and rhythmic scrubbing. At the heart of this operation was the mid-level eunuch, a man who had likely traded his future progeny for a life of measuring soap and inspecting hemlines. Let's look at a man like Eunuch Sun. Sun wasn't a political mastermind. He wasn't whispering secrets into the emperor's ear or plotting the downfall of a rival consort. No. Sun's entire universe was governed by the specific gravity of wet silk and the precise temperature required to remove a faint tea stain from a ceremonial robe without damaging the gold thread. The imperial laundry wasn't just a room with some basins. It was a sprawling complex of stone courtyards and wooden drying racks that felt like a quiet, humid forest. Every morning, before the sun had even cleared the yellow-tiled roofs of the palace, Sun would receive the daily intake. This was handled with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious relics. Each garment was logged in a massive, damp-proof book. You had the everyday robes, the formal court attire, the seasonal vestments, and the intimate wear, which was treated with a sort of hushed, terrified respect. The sheer volume of clothing was staggering. The Qing emperors didn't exactly believe in the capsule wardrobe trend. They had thousands of garments, many of which were only worn once for a specific ritual and then sent back to the laundry to be refreshed. Eunuch Sun would stand over the massive stone vats, his hands perpetually pruned from the water, overseeing a team of lower-ranking workers who moved with the coordinated slowness of a school of fish. There was a specific protocol for every fabric. You didn't wash imperial yellow the same way you washed a commoner's indigo. The water had to be drawn from specific wells, rumored to be softer on the threads. The soap was a specialized mixture of crushed beans and aromatic herbs, designed to cleanse without being aggressive, because heaven forbid the laundry be aggressive. Everything in Eunuch Sun's world had to be gentle, muted, and repetitive. The most hypnotic part of the process was the drying. In the inner courtyards, hundreds of yards of silk would be hung on bamboo poles. When the breeze moved through the Forbidden City, these silks would sway in unison, a silent, colorful ballet of damp fabric. Eunuch Sun would walk between the rows, his eyes scanning for water spots, the ultimate enemy of the laundry eunuch. A water spot on a formal robe could lead to a very long, very unpleasant conversation with a palace manager, so Sun spent hours just watching fabric dry. It was his primary job function, watching moisture evaporate. Ironing was another ritual of extreme boredom. They used heavy brass irons filled with glowing coals, smoothed over the silk with agonizing slowness. One wrong move, 1 second of distraction, and you'd have a scorched hole in a piece of history. But distraction was rare, because in the laundry service, time didn't exist in hours or minutes. It existed in the cooling of an iron or the fading of a damp patch.
The laundry eunuchs also had to deal with the complex politics of the concubines' wardrobes. Each lady of the court had her own specific preferences, and more importantly, her own specific rank. Washing a third-rank consort's dress before a first-rank consort's dress was a social blunder that could cause ripples of gossip for weeks. Sun had to be a diplomat of the washboard, navigating the delicate egos of hundreds of women he would never actually meet, all through the medium of their laundry. Then there were the scenting rooms. After the clothes were washed and dried and ironed, they were placed over large wicker frames. Beneath these frames, small censers burned specific blends of sandalwood, musk, and dried flower petals. The goal was to ensure the emperor smelled like a divine garden rather than a human being who had been sitting in a stuffy throne room all day. Sun would sit in the scenting room, enveloped in a thick, fragrant fog, making sure the smoke was distributed evenly. It was a drowsy, aromatic limbo.
The life of a laundry eunuch was a life of clean, organized stasis. While the rest of the world was changing, while empires were rising and falling outside the Great Wall, Eunuch Sun was worrying about the lint on a winter cloak. There is something deeply peaceful about that level of narrow focus. His world was small, humid, and smelled like jasmine and wet stone. As the sun set over the palace, the dried clothes were folded. This wasn't just folding, it was a form of soft engineering. Each sleeve had to be tucked just so, each pleat aligned with the precision of a mathematical proof. The finished piles were wrapped in yellow cloth and placed in lacquered chests, ready to be carried back into the heart of the palace by a procession of silent, velvet-footed attendants. Sun would then close his ledger, his hands finally dry, and look out over his silent kingdom of empty basins and wooden racks. He was a man who had mastered the art of the mundane, a guardian of the imperial appearance. He would sleep in a small, sparse room, dreaming of perfectly clear water and the endless, rhythmic sound of the scrubbing brush. When the tea was finally brewed, it was done by a specialist who used a thermometer that didn't use numbers, but rather shrimp eyes and crab bubbles. These were the poetic terms for the size of the bubbles forming at the bottom of the pot. The master would watch the water with the intensity of a hawk, waiting for the exact moment the shrimp eyes appeared. If he missed it by 3 seconds, the pot was dumped and the whole process started over. It was a world where a 3-second error was a tragedy, but a 3-hour wait was just standard procedure. The emperor would finally receive his cup presented on a jade tray. He would take a sip, perhaps nod slightly, and that was it. Thousands of hours of labor, hundreds of miles of travel, and a decade of bureaucratic filing, all for a single warm swallow. And then the cup would be returned, the dregs would be inspected by the eunuchs to ensure the emperor was digesting the essence correctly, and the paperwork would be filed away in the great archive of refreshments. Let's think about the archives for a moment. There are ledgers in Beijing that record the tea consumption of the Qianlong emperor for every single day of his 60-year reign. You can look up what he drank on a Tuesday in 1754, how many grams were used, which spring the water came from, and who the shift supervisor was at the firing shed in Hangzhou. It is a monument to the human desire to document the ephemeral. It is the history of a flavor recorded with the gravity of a constitutional amendment. As we drift further into the mist of the tea mountains, imagine the quiet. No machines, no engines, just the sound of a brush on paper and the soft pop of a bubble in a cast iron kettle. The world of the Qing tea trade was a world that moved at the speed of a cooling cup. It was a place where the greatest virtue was the ability to wait for the rain, to wait for the bud, to wait for the water to boil, and to wait for the ink on the report to finally dry. Chapter 4. The Measured Stride of the Imperial Palanquin Bearers. If you think your daily commute is stressful, consider for a moment the life of a Qing Dynasty palanquin bearer. Their entire existence was a study in the suppression of human instinct. For these men, the goal was not to move quickly, but to move as if they were not moving at all. They were tasked with carrying the emperor, a man considered a living god, across the uneven cobblestones of the Forbidden City without ever allowing the tea in his cup to ripple. It was a career built on the foundation of the world's most disciplined and most tedious walking. The training for a palanquin bearer began in a quiet courtyard far from the public eye. They didn't start by carrying the emperor, of course not. They started by carrying a wooden frame filled with large, shallow bowls of water. The trainees would spend hours walking in a straight line, their eyes fixed on the horizon, while an instructor watched the water. If a single drop spilled, the entire group had to stop, reset, and begin the march again. They weren't just learning to walk, they were learning to eliminate the bounce from the human gait. It was a specific gliding step. They didn't walk heel to toe like a normal person. Instead, they slid their feet along the ground, keeping their knees slightly bent at all times to act as biological shock absorbers. It was a physically exhausting and mentally numbing step. Imagine walking for 4 miles at a pace of 2 miles per hour, never allowing your head to bob up or down by more than half an inch. It was a slow-motion marathon of the mundane. The bureaucracy behind the palanquin service was, as you might expect, massive. There were different teams for different types of transport. You had the 8-man bearers for formal processions, and the more intimate 4-man bearers for moving through the private residential quarters. Each team had a leader who set the pace using a small, silent hand signal. They didn't use drums or chants. That would be far too noisy for the imperial ears. They communicated through the subtle shiftings of their shoulders and the shared rhythm of their breath. One of the most ironic aspects of this job was the uniform code. Despite the fact that they were performing back-breaking labor in the humid Beijing summers, they had to look perfectly crisp. Their silks had to be ironed, likely by our friend Eunuch Sun from the laundry, and their hats had to be perfectly level. If a bearer's hat tilted during a journey, it was seen as a sign of physical weakness, or worse, a lack of spiritual focus. The routes through the Forbidden City were also highly regulated. There were summer paths that prioritized shade and winter paths that sought the sun, but every route was measured to the inch. The palanquin office kept detailed maps where the travel time between any two gates was calculated down to the second. If a journey took 22 minutes last week, it must take 22 minutes today. Any variation suggested that the bearers were either rushing, which was undignified, or lagging, which was disrespectful. Let's think about the palanquin logs. Yes, there were logs for the chairs. Every time the emperor sat down, a clerk would record the time, the specific chair used, the names of the 8 bearers, and the weather conditions. If the emperor mentioned that the ride felt slightly jarring near the Gate of Supreme Harmony, an investigation would be launched. The cobblestones would be inspected, the bearer's shoes would be checked for uneven wear, and a 3-page report would be filed. It was a system where a pebble was a political crisis. The chairs themselves were marvels of unexciting engineering. They were made of heavy phoebe wood, draped in thick yellow silks, and fitted with internal cushions that were stuffed with specific types of dried grasses to provide the perfect balance of firmness and give. The maintenance of the poles was a science in itself. The wood had to be kept at a specific level of oiliness so it wouldn't creak. A creaking palanquin was a failure of the highest order. The bearers would spend their off hours rubbing mineral oil into the wood with soft cloths, a rhythmic, circular task that probably felt quite similar to the tea firing we discussed earlier.
As the emperor was carried through the palace, he was often reading or even sleeping. The bearers were essentially the human equivalent of a cloud. They were supposed to be invisible, silent, and perfectly stable. They would walk past the silent laundry yards, past the steaming tea offices, their gliding steps creating a faint shush-shush sound on the stone. It was a world of hushed movements and carefully managed gravity. There is a certain Zen-like quality to the life of a bearer. They had to achieve a state of total physical synchronicity with 7 other men. They had to become a single organism with 16 legs and one shared purpose, to move a heavy box across a courtyard without disturbing the air. It was a life of extreme physical discipline applied to the most repetitive task imaginable. When a bearer grew too old to maintain the glide, he didn't just retire. He usually became an instructor, standing in the same courtyards where he had once trained, watching the water in the bowls, and waiting for the next generation to master the art of the perfect, boring walk. The cycle continued, century after century, a slow procession of yellow silk and gliding feet that moved through history without ever making a splash. We'll leave the bearers now, resting in the shade of a marble bridge, their breathing finally slowing down, their eyes still fixed on the horizon as they wait for the next call to duty. There's no need to hurry. The emperor isn't going anywhere fast, and neither are we. We're just drifting along the smooth, level path of the imperial routine. Chapter 5. The Mechanical Stasis of the Imperial Clockwinders. By the late 18th century, the Forbidden City had become obsessed with a very specific, very noisy kind of toy, the European clock. But in the hands of the Qing bureaucracy, these ticking marvels weren't just timepieces. They were transformed into instruments of profound, rhythmic monotony.
We are entering the Office of Celestial Distant Chimes, a department where the primary goal was to ensure that the passage of time was as loud, as ornate, and as perfectly regulated as humanly possible. The emperors, particularly Qianlong, were collectors. They owned thousands of clocks, clocks with miniature waterfalls, clocks with mechanical birds that flapped their wings, and clocks where tiny brass scholars would write out "Long live the emperor" every hour on the hour. But someone had to keep these thousands of tiny gears moving. This was the life of the imperial clockwinder, a man who lived his life in increments of clicks and winding keys. Imagine a room filled with 200 clocks, all ticking at slightly different intervals. For a normal person, this would be a nightmare of noise. For the clockwinder, it was a symphony of administrative success. His day didn't start with a bang, but with the first turn of a silver key. He would move from clock to clock with the same gliding step as the palanquin bearers, his hands steady, his mind focused entirely on the resistance of a mainspring. The bureaucracy of the clock office was, of course, impeccable. Every clock had its own health ledger. In this book, the winder would record the exact time the clock was wound, the number of rotations given to the key, and the perceived mood of the mechanism. If a mechanical bird chirped with a slightly hoarse tone, it was a matter for the departmental head. If a clock gained 3 seconds over the course of a week, it was subjected to a temporal audit that could last days. The tools of the trade were kept in velvet-lined boxes. There were tiny brushes made of squirrel hair for removing specks of dust that were invisible to the naked eye. There were vials of oil so refined they were practically transparent. The winders would spend hours just cleaning a single gear, moving the brush in the same circular motion we've seen in the salt pans and the laundry vats. It was a culture of the minute, a devotion to the invisible. The most stressful and yet most boring time of day was the syncing. This happened at noon. The lead winder would stand in the center of the hall, watching a sundial in the courtyard. At the precise moment the shadow hit the center line, he would signal. Throughout the palace, hundreds of eunuchs would reach out and adjust the minute hands of their respective clocks. It was a massive, coordinated effort to make sure that the entire Forbidden City hummed in the same key. But because these were mechanical clocks, they were never truly in sync. Within 20 minutes, the tick-tock would begin to drift. The symphony would become a cacophony again, and the winders would simply sigh, open their ledgers, and begin the process of recording the drift. They weren't trying to defeat time, they were just trying to document their struggle against it. There was a particular irony in the eternal clocks. These were massive water-powered devices that were supposed to run forever. In reality, they required a team of 12 men to constantly haul water to the top reservoir and clear silt from the bottom. These men were the unsung heroes of the mundane. They spent their lives moving water in a circle so that a brass ball could drop down a chute once an hour. It was the ultimate expression of the Qing philosophy, immense effort expended to keep things exactly as they were. As night fell over the clock rooms, the sound changed. The birds stopped chirping, the waterfalls were silenced for the night, and all that remained was the low collective heartbeat of 1,000 ticking gears. The winder would take his final rounds, checking the weights and the pendulums by the light of a single lantern. He was the guardian of the emperor's seconds, a man who understood that history isn't just made of great events, it's made of the tiny, relentless intervals between them. We'll leave the clock office now, with its ticking and its whirring, and its endless rows of tiny polished brass teeth. The keys are back in their boxes, the ledgers are closed. The time is exactly what the bureaucracy says it is, and not a second faster. Chapter 6. The Seasonal Migration of the Imperial Wardrobe.
The changing of the seasons in the Forbidden City was not marked by the weather. The weather was far too unpredictable for the Qing court. Instead, the seasons were officially inaugurated by the changing of the emperor's hat. We are now entering the quiet, mothballed world of the Department of Ceremonial Attire, a place where the movement of a single silk robe from a cedar chest to a jade hanger was treated with the logistical gravity of a military campaign. The Qing wardrobe was a living thing, consisting of tens of thousands of items, each governed by the sumptuary statutes. These laws were so specific, they dictated exactly which day of the lunar calendar the emperor would switch from his velvet winter cap to his rattan summer hat. It didn't matter if there was a freak snowstorm in late spring or a heat wave in autumn, the emperor wore what the calendar told him to wear. And the men responsible for this transition were the wardrobe stewards, the ultimate masters of the seasonal shuffle. Imagine a vast network of underground storage vaults, cool and dry, filled with rows upon rows of lacquered trunks. Inside these trunks lay the off-season garments. Every piece of clothing was wrapped in layers of specially treated paper to prevent yellowing, and interspersed with sachets of dried tobacco and camphor to repel insects. The stewards spent their entire lives in these vaults, living in a perpetual state of pre-season preparation. The process of the Great Rotation began weeks before the official date. A steward, let's call him Eunuch Chen, would receive a manifest from the Grand Secretariat. This manifest was a masterpiece of boring detail. It listed every robe, every sash, every pair of boots, and every thumb ring required for the coming 3 months. Chen would then begin the slow, rhythmic process of unboxing. Each garment had to be inspected for structural integrity. This meant checking every single seed pearl on a ceremonial collar to ensure it wasn't loose. It meant examining the gold-wrapped threads of a dragon's claw to see if it had frayed by a fraction of a millimeter. Chen would use a small magnifying glass and a pair of bamboo tweezers, moving over the fabric with the same agonizing slowness we saw in the tea-tasting rooms. If a single thread was out of place, it didn't just need a repair, it needed a formal report. The airing out was perhaps the most peaceful part of the routine. Thousands of robes would be brought out into the high-walled courtyards and hung on long racks. For a brief window of time, the gray stone of the palace was hidden behind a forest of embroidered silk. Dragons of blue, red, and gold would shimmer in the afternoon sun, swaying gently in the breeze. The stewards would walk among them, not speaking, just watching the fabric breathe. It was a silent, colorful ritual of patience. Once the clothes were aired, they had to be re-indexed. This was the heart of the bureaucracy. Every item had a wooden tag with a number that corresponded to a page in a master ledger. If a robe was moved from vault A to wardrobe B, the ledger had to reflect that move in 3 different places. There were clerks who did nothing but update the location of the emperor's socks. It was a world where a misplaced pair of leggings could trigger a departmental audit that lasted a month. The transition day itself was a masterpiece of choreographed monotony. At a specific hour, a procession of eunuchs would carry the current season chests into the emperor's private quarters, while a second procession carried the past season chests back to the vaults. They moved with that same gliding palanquin-bearer step, their faces expressionless, their movements synchronized. It was the biological equivalent of a gear turning in a clock, smooth, predictable, and entirely devoid of excitement. Then there was the matter of the tribute silks. Every year, thousands of bolts of new fabric arrived from the south. These weren't even clothes yet, they were just possibilities. But each bolt had to be measured, its color compared against a standard imperial chart, and its texture graded. The wardrobe stewards would spend days unrolling silk, feeling it between their fingers, and then rolling it back up. The sound of silk unrolling, a soft, dry hiss, was the soundtrack to their lives. Even the scraps were documented. In the imperial tailor shops, every piece of leftover silk larger than a fingernail had to be accounted for. You couldn't just throw away a piece of a dragon robe. It had to be logged, bagged, and sent to the fragment repository,
where it would sit for decades, waiting for a repair that might never come. It was a closed loop of material obsession. As we look at eunuch Chen, standing in his quiet vault with a ledger in one hand and a silk sash in the other, we see the true nature of the Qing state. It was a system that found comfort in the catalog. It believed that if you could just label everything, every grain of salt, every cup of tea, and every thread of silk, you could somehow stop the world from changing. It was a beautiful, doomed attempt to organize the universe into a series of well-maintained trunks. We'll leave Chen now as he carefully folds a winter robe and places it into its cedar home for the next 9 months. The air is still, the vault is cool, and the only sound is the soft rustle of paper being smoothed over silk. The seasons have changed on paper, and that is all that matters. Chapter 7. The Silent Alchemy of the Imperial Ink Makers. To understand the ink of the Qing Dynasty, you have to understand the smell of a very specific kind of silence. We are moving away from the rustle of silk and into the dark, soot-stained workshops of the imperial ink manufactory. Here, the pace of life wasn't just slow, it was geological. The creation of a single stick of high-grade ink, the kind used for the emperor's private calligraphy, could take up to 2 years from start to finish. It was a process of waiting for things to settle, waiting for things to dry, and waiting for things to age.
The foundation of all imperial ink was soot, but not just any soot. The most prestigious ink was made from the smoke of ancient pine trees gathered from the Huangshan Mountains. The smoke collectors were men of incredible patience. They would build small, specialized kilns and burn the pine wood so slowly that it barely produced a flame, only a thick, heavy cloud of carbon. This soot would settle on the interior walls of the kiln in layers as thin as a moth's wing. Every few days, a worker would go in with a soft feather brush and gently sweep the soot into a silk bag. He had to move with a stillness that would make our palanquin bearers look frantic. If he breathed too hard, the soot, which was lighter than air, would simply vanish into the atmosphere. This collection process alone could take months. Imagine a man spending his entire summer in a dark, cramped hut, gently brushing dust into a bag. It is the pinnacle of historical monotony. Once the soot was gathered, it had to be mixed with glue. But this wasn't just any glue. It was a gelatin made from donkey hides or ox hides, boiled down for days until it reached a state of perfect, translucent stickiness. The ratio of soot to glue was a secret guarded more fiercely than the palace gates. An imperial ink master, let's call him Master Mao, would spend hours adjusting the mixture, adding a drop of water, a pinch of crushed pearl, or a splash of musk to give the ink its signature life. The mixing wasn't done with a machine, of course. It was done by hand, using a heavy wooden pestle in a stone mortar. Master Mao's apprentices would take turns pounding the mixture. They had to strike the dough exactly 30,000 times, not 29,000, not 31,000, 30,000. They would count in their heads, a rhythmic thumping meditation that lasted for days on end. The sound, thump, squish, was the heartbeat of the workshop. After the 30,000 strikes, the ink was a thick black dough. It was then pressed into wooden molds. These molds were works of art themselves, carved with intricate scenes of mountains or poems about the brevity of life, ironic considering how long it took to make the ink. The ink would sit in the mold for several days, taking on the shape of the wood. But the real waiting was only just beginning. The drying process was an administrative nightmare. You couldn't just put the ink in the sun, it would crack. You couldn't put it in a damp room, it would mold. Instead, the ink sticks were buried in large boxes of ash. The ash would slowly, over the course of 6 to 12 months, draw the moisture out of the ink at a rate that was almost imperceptible. Master Mao would check the boxes once a week, gently rotating the sticks with his fingers, feeling for the subtle change in weight that signaled progress. The bureaucracy of the ink office kept track of every batch. There were aging ledgers that recorded when a batch was molded, which ash box it was placed in, and who was responsible for its rotation. Some sticks were aged for 5, 10, or even 20 years. The older the ink, the more mellow the black. There was a belief that ink, like a fine wine or a tired bureaucrat, became more refined the longer it sat in a dark room doing absolutely nothing. Once the ink was finally dried and aged, it was finished. This involved painting the carved designs with gold leaf or vermilion. A specialist would sit with a brush consisting of exactly 3 hairs, carefully filling in the tiny characters of a poem. He would do this all day, every day, his world shrinking down to the tip of that 3-hair brush. It was a life of microscopic focus, a slow-motion dance of gold on black. The final product was a hard, heavy stick that felt like stone. When the emperor wanted to write, he would rub this stick on a flat inkstone with a few drops of water. The sound of the ink being ground, a soft, sandy grr, grr, was the sound of 2 years of labor being slowly undone. It was a meditative act that preceded every state document, every poem, and every laundry list. As we look at Master Mao standing in his quiet, soot-stained room, we see a man who has mastered the art of the wait. He doesn't care about the outside world. He cares about the 30,000th strike of the pestle. He cares about the moisture level in a box of ash. He is a guardian of the black, a man who knows that the most important things in life are the ones that take the longest to settle. Chapter 8. The Weight of the World in a Square of Jade. Now that we have the blackest of inks and the finest of papers, we must consider the final, heavy punctuation mark of every imperial document, the seal. We are drifting into the world of the imperial seal carvers, a small group of highly specialized artisans who lived their lives in a world of inverse thinking. For a seal carver, everything had to be imagined in reverse, carved into stone so that it would appear forward on paper. It was a career of mental gymnastics performed at the speed of a snail. The imperial seals, or shi, were not just stamps. They were the physical manifestations of the mandate of heaven. Some were so large and heavy they required 2 eunuchs to lift them, moving with that practiced gliding step we know so well. But before a seal could be lifted, it had to be carved, and the process of carving an imperial seal was an exercise of administrative and physical endurance that could last for years. Let's look at Master Lu. Lu didn't just pick up a piece of jade and start hacking away. That would be unthinkable. First, there was the stone selection phase. When a new seal was commissioned, perhaps to commemorate a particularly long and boring poem the emperor had written, scouts were sent to the far reaches of the empire to find the perfect block of nephrite. The stone had to be flawless, with no veins of improper color. The search alone could take 18 months of trekking through mountain passes and filing regional geological reports. Once the stone arrived in Beijing, it was subjected to the initial observation. Master Lu and his colleagues would sit with the block of jade for weeks. They wouldn't touch it. They would just look at it. They were waiting for the stone to speak, or more accurately, they were waiting for the Bureau of Ceremonies to finalize exactly the wording of the seal's inscription. In the Qing court, a singly character could be debated by a committee of scholars for an entire season. Was the character for prosperity too ornate? Was the imperial radical properly balanced? These were the questions that kept men awake in the quiet hours of the night.
The carving itself was a masterpiece of friction. Jade is incredibly hard. You don't cut it so much as you wear it down with abrasives. Master Lu used tiny drills and wires coated with a paste of crushed garnets and sand. He would sit at a low table, his hands braced against a wooden block, and begin the slow, rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch of the wire. He might spend an entire week on a single stroke of a single character. The sound of the seal carving shop was a constant, low-frequency hum. It was the sound of persistence overcoming mineral resistance. Master Lu's world was a few square inches of pale green stone, slowly yielding to his will. Because the characters had to be carved in seal script, an ancient, highly stylized form of Chinese writing, the work felt less like calligraphy and more like architecture. Each line had to be perfectly vertical or perfectly horizontal. There was no room for artistic flair. There was only room for imperial perfection. The bureaucracy surrounding the seals was, predictably, suffocating. Every seal had a biography. This was a ledger that recorded the date the stone was found, the names of the carvers, the number of hours spent on the inscription, and even the weight of the jade dust that was filed away during the process. Nothing was lost. Even the dust was bagged and tagged, as if the emperor's essence had somehow rubbed off into the debris. Then there was the matter of the seal paste. You couldn't use the black ink we discussed in the last chapter for a seal. That would be a gross violation of protocol. Seals required red paste, or yin ni. This was made from a mixture of pulverized cinnabar, castor oil, and, because the Qing loved a specific texture, the fuzz from the underside of moxa leaves. The paste had to be aged in ceramic vats, stirred by hand every day for 3 years to ensure the oil and the cinnabar never separated. Master Lu would spend his breaks stirring the red goo, a slow, circular motion that probably felt like a holiday compared to the jade grinding. When the seal was finally finished, it was tested. A high-ranking eunuch would bring a sheet of the finest paper, and Master Lu would apply the paste. The seal would be pressed down with the full weight of the carver's body, held for a count of 60, and then lifted with a gentle vertical motion. If the red impression was anything less than a solid, vibrant square of perfection, the seal was sent back for refinement, another month of scritch, scritch, scritch. These seals were used to validate the most mundane of documents. A permit for salt? It got a seal. A report on the laundry? It got a seal. Every time the heavy jade hit the paper, it was a reminder that the entire weight of the empire was behind that specific, boring piece of information. The seal gave the paper authority, but it also gave it weight. A stack of sealed documents felt more substantial, more permanent, like a collection of tiny, paper-thin bricks. As Master Lu grew old, his eyesight would fade, but his hands never forgot the rhythm of the stone. He would spend his final years teaching apprentices how to breathe in sync with the movement of the wire. "Do not fight the jade," he would whisper. "Wait for the jade to become the character." It was a philosophy of surrender to the process. We'll leave the carvers now, in their shop filled with green dust and red paste. The scritch, scritch of the wires continues, a steady, hypnotic pulse in the heart of the city. The jade is hard, the paste is thick, and the history of the empire is being pressed into the paper, one heavy red square at a time. Chapter 9. The Infinite Echoes of the Great Archive. We have reached the final destination of every salt permit, every laundry list, and every tea tasting report. We are entering the great archive of mundane affairs. If the Forbidden City was the heart of the empire, this was its memory, a vast, silent, and incredibly dusty memory. Here, the bureaucracy didn't just live, it achieved a kind of gray immortality. The pace here isn't just slow, it has effectively stopped. We are in a world where a document from 100 years ago is treated with the same immediate, quiet boredom as a document from yesterday. The head archivist, a man we shall call Senior Clerk Feng, was a man who lived in a state of permanent afterward. His job was not to create, but to categorize. He presided over rows of towering cedar cabinets that stretched into the dim, unlit corners of the hall. The air here was thick with the scent of aged paper, dried ink, and the faint, sweet smell of the insect-repellent herbs tucked into the folds of the scrolls. It was an atmosphere that invited sleep, a heavy atmospheric pressure of accumulated facts. Every morning, a fresh card of documents would arrive from the various offices we visited. Fang would receive them with a slight, weary nod. He didn't look for excitement in these papers. He looked for conformity. Was the scroll the correct width? Was the seal in the lower right quadrant? Was the calligraphy consistent with the departmental style? For Fang, a good document was one that looked exactly like the 10,000 documents that came before it. The process of filing was a ritual of extreme precision. A document wasn't just put in a drawer. First, it was cross-referenced. Fang would open a master ledger, a book so large it required its own small table, and record the arrival of the paper. He would note the date, the department of origin, and the specific shelf coordinate where it would live. Then the document was wrapped in a protective sleeve of acid-free yellow silk, and finally it was placed in its designated spot, tucked away like a sleeping child. The Great Archive was organized by a system that only made sense to the people who lived there. There were sections for the salt permits of the Southern Reaches, 1720 to 1740, and the daily expenditures of the Imperial Scullery. There was even a section for corrective reports on previous misfilings. It was a recursive loop of documentation. If a clerk made a mistake in the archives, the report about that mistake was filed in the archives, right next to the mistake itself.
Fang's greatest challenge was the humidity. In the summer months, the archive became a battlefield, but the weapons weren't swords. They were small charcoal heaters and fans made of ostrich feathers. The archivists would spend their days gently moving air around the room, making sure the dampness didn't settle into the fibers of the paper. They would walk the aisles, touching the cabinets with the back of their hands, feeling for the subtle, cold moisture of a potential mold outbreak. It was a life of tactile vigilance. There is a certain irony in the fact that these men spent their lives preserving records that almost no one would ever read again. Once a salt permit was filed, it was effectively gone from the world of the living. It became a ghost of a transaction. But for Fang, the value wasn't in the reading, it was in the having. The empire was whole because its records were complete. As long as the paper was in the drawer, the universe was in balance. Sometimes the emperor would request a specific record. Perhaps he wanted to know exactly how much charcoal was used in the winter of 1731. This would trigger a retrieval event. It was the closest thing the archive had to an action sequence. Fang would consult his ledgers, locate the coordinates, and lead a small procession of junior clerks to the specific cabinet. They would move with that gliding step, their lanterns casting long, slow-moving shadows against the cedar walls. The document would be retrieved, dusted with a soft brush, and carried to the palace on a velvet tray. After the emperor was satisfied, the document would return, and the process would happen in reverse. The return to the drawer was always more satisfying than the departure. It was the closing of a circle. The charcoal usage of 1731 was back in its home, silent and safe, ready to wait another century for its next moment of relevance. As we look at Clerk Fang sitting at his desk at the end of a long, dark aisle, we see a man who is at peace with the passage of time. He doesn't fear the end of the dynasty or the changing of the world. He knows that whatever happens, it will eventually be written down on a piece of paper and brought to him. He will give it a coordinate, wrap it in silk, and put it in a drawer. And there it will stay, in the quiet, dusty heart of the great archive, as the world outside fades into the soft gray light of history. The lanterns are being extinguished now, one by one. The cabinets are closed, the ledgers are shut, the ink is dry, the salt is weighed, and the emperor's robes are perfectly folded. We have reached the end of our journey through the paperwork of the Qing. It is time to let the silence of the archives settle over us, heavy and warm, like a stack of ancient, well-filed scrolls.
I hope you enjoyed this journey through the most beautifully boring parts of the past. The history is safe, the records are complete, and now the archives are closed for the night. Chapter 10. The Aromatic Arithmetic of the Nutmeg Warehouses. We are shifting our gaze from the yellow-tiled roofs of Beijing to the humid wooden docks of the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. While the Qing were masters of the salt permit, the Dutch were the undisputed kings of the spice ledger. We are entering a world where the air is thick with the scent of nutmeg, cloves, and heavy oil-soaked oak. It is a world governed by the Heren 17 men in Amsterdam who spent their lives obsessing over cargo manifests from the other side of the planet. The Dutch approach to boredom was a slightly different from the Chinese. It was a more mathematical kind of monotony. While the Qing were looking for cosmic harmony, the Dutch were looking for a zero balance at the end of a fiscal year. Every single nutmeg seed, a small, brown, wrinkled thing no larger than a marble, was treated as a sacred unit of accounting. We are now following a mid-level warehouse clerk in Batavia, let's call him Peter, whose entire life is a slow-motion inventory of the pungent and the precious. Peter's day begins with the opening of the warehouse doors. The sound, a long, low groan of iron on wood, is the official start of the morning's tedium. As the light spills into the dark, cavernous space, it reveals thousands of burlap sacks, each stacked with geometric precision. Peter doesn't see spices, he sees units of potential profit. He carries a clipboard, a stack of pre-printed forms, and a very small, very sharp pencil. The primary task in the nutmeg warehouse was the turn. Because nutmeg is rich in essential oils, the sacks couldn't just sit there. If they were left alone, the oil would settle at the bottom, the seeds would clump, and the value would drop. So, every week, Peter and his team of laborers would move every single sack in the warehouse. They didn't move them far, just a few feet to the left or right, turning them over so the oils would redistribute. It was a rhythmic, repetitive labor that felt like a very slow, very aromatic game of chess. The smell in the warehouse was enough to make a normal person dizzy, but Peter had long since lost his sense of smell to the overwhelming clouds of spice dust. To him, it just smelled like work. He would walk the aisles, tapping the sacks with a wooden rod to listen for the hollow sound of a perfectly dried seed. If he heard a thud, it meant moisture. Moisture was the enemy. Moisture led to mold, and mold led to a 3-page explanatory letter to the Heren 17, which Peter dreaded more than the plague. The bureaucracy of the VOC was a monster of its own making. Every shipment had to be documented in the Generali Missivi. Peter had to record the number of sacks, the weight of each sack, measured in Dutch pounds, the ship of origin, and the name of the captain. But that
Wasn't all. He also had to record the wastage, the seeds that had crumbled during the voyage or had been eaten by the particularly well-seasoned warehouse rats. The rat audit was perhaps the most absurdly detailed part of Peter's job. The VOC actually had a budget for warehouse cats, and Peter had to document the efficiency of these cats. If a cat wasn't catching enough rats, it was a line item in the quarterly report. You can imagine the scene. A man in a damp Dutch collar, sitting under a tropical sun, writing a formal complaint about a cat named Jasper who was too lazy to protect the nutmeg. Then there was the liming process. Before the nutmeg could be shipped to Europe, it had to be dipped in a solution of lime. This wasn't for flavor, it was to sterilize the seeds so they couldn't be planted elsewhere. The Dutch wanted a total monopoly, and they achieved it through the slow whitewashing of millions of individual nuts. Peter would stand over the lime vats, watching the brown seeds turn ghostly white. It was a silent chemical ritual that transformed a living plant into a sterile commodity. The transport of the ledgers was almost as important as the transport of the spice. The books were kept in double-locked chests. One key was held by Peter, and the other by the Governor-General. When a ship sailed for Amsterdam, a copy of the ledger was placed in a waterproof tin box and lashed to the mainmast. If the ship sank, The sailors were instructed to save the tin box first. The lives of the crew were secondary to the integrity of the arithmetic. As Peter worked, he would often drift into a state of ledger trance. He would see the world in columns. The palm trees outside were just vertical lines. The waves on the sea were just fluctuating margins. His world was composed of ink, lime dust, and the sound of burlap scraping on stone. It was a life of extreme sensory overload, rendered into the most boring possible format. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Peter would seal his inkwell. He would lock the warehouse doors, the heavy groan echoing across the harbor. The nutmeg was turned, the lime was dry, and the rats were hopefully being pursued by Jasper. Another day had been successfully converted into 3 pages of flawless copperplate handwriting. We'll leave Peter now, walking slowly back to his small, humid house, his clothes still dusted with white lime and brown spice. The ledgers are safe in their chests, and the spice is safe in its sacks. The Dutch monopoly continues, one slow, methodical tally at a time. Chapter 11. The Slow Calculation of the King's Broad Arrow. We are leaving the pungent, humid docks of the Dutch East Indies and traveling across the cold, choppy Atlantic to the primeval forests of the 18th century New England. Here, the air doesn't smell of nutmeg or ink. It smells of damp pine needles, wet wool, and wood smoke. We are entering the world of the surveyors of the forest, men whose lives were dedicated to the incredibly slow and controversial task of looking at trees. In the 1700s, the British Royal Navy was the most powerful force on the planet, but it had a very specific biological problem. It was constantly running out of masts. A first-rate ship of the line required a mainmast made from a single, straight white tree that was at least 40 inches in diameter and over 100 feet tall. These trees were the giants of the forest, and the King of England claimed every single one of them as his personal property. To manage this leafy empire, he sent out surveyors to walk through the woods and mark the chosen ones. Let's follow a surveyor named Elias. Elias's job was a masterpiece of outdoor monotony. He didn't cut trees, he didn't mill wood, he simply walked. He would spend months trekking through the dense, trackless wilderness of New Hampshire or Maine, his eyes perpetually tilted upward at a 45-degree angle. He was looking for perfection in a world of crooked branches and rot. When Elias found a suitable tree, a mast pine, he didn't cheer. He simply took out his broad arrow iron. This was a heavy tool used to cut 3 deep gashes into the bark, forming the shape of an inverted V with a vertical line in the center. This was the king's broad arrow, a symbol that meant this tree was no longer a tree, it was a naval asset. Marking single trees took about 30 seconds, but finding that tree might have taken Elias 3 weeks of wading through hip-deep snow and eating salted pork. The bureaucracy of the forest was surprisingly dense. Every marked tree had to be recorded in a mast registry. Elias would sit by his campfire at night, his hands stiff with cold, and record the tree's approximate height, its girth at chest level, and its distance from the nearest navigable river. This last part was crucial. A perfect tree was useless if it was 10 miles from a river. You couldn't exactly put a 100-foot pine in a wagon and pull it over a mountain. The river logs were another layer of administrative detail. Elias had to map the local waterways, noting which ones were deep enough during the spring thaw to float a mast-length timber. He spent hours tossing sticks into streams and timing how long they took to reach a certain bend, recording the results in a damp, leather-bound book. It was a study in the fluid dynamics of a puddle. There was also the constant low-grade friction with the local colonists. The colonists didn't care about the king's navy. They wanted the white pine for their own floorboards and barns. This led to the pine tree riot style of bureaucracy, where Elias would return to a marked tree, only to find it had been accidentally cut down and turned into unrecognizable planks. Elias would then have to file a report of depredation, a document that required him to describe the stump, estimate the lost value, and list the names of any suspicious-looking woodsmen he had seen in the area. The masting season itself was a slow-motion spectacle. Once the ground was frozen and covered with snow, which made sliding heavy logs easier, the trees were finally felled. This was the only part of Elias's job that involved any sense of dramatic conclusion. Giant pines would crash to the earth, the sound echoing for miles across the frozen woods. It wasn't a ledger, it was a log. It wasn't intense study, it was intense weight.
Done with the surgical precision of a watchmaker. If a 100-foot tree fell the wrong way and hit a rock, it would shatter, and months of Elias's surveying would be wasted. They would build pillows of smaller branches to catch the giant, ensuring it landed softly. Watching a team of 80 oxen pull a single mast through the forest was perhaps the most hypnotic sight in the colonial world. The oxen moved at a pace that was nearly imperceptible. The sled would groan, the snow would crunch, and the men would shout in a rhythmic, low-frequency cadence. Elias would walk alongside, his clipboard in hand, recording the progress. Day 4, moved 3/4 of a mile, 1 ox yoke broken, snow depth remains favorable. When the masts finally reached the mast yards at the coast, they were placed in mast ponds, freshwater enclosures where the logs would soak for years. This was the final stage of the surveyor's oversight. The water kept the wood from drying out and cracking, but it also required constant monitoring of the water levels and salinity. Elias would spend his twilight years walking the perimeter of these ponds, checking the submerged logs and updating his ledgers. The life of a forest surveyor was a life of long silences and vertical perspectives. Elias lived in a world of bark patterns and river currents, a man who saw the future of the British Empire not in battles, but in the slow, steady growth of a pine needle. He was the guardian of the Navy's skeleton, a man who understood that the greatest power on earth began with a man alone in the woods, holding a piece of iron and looking for a straight line. We'll leave Elias now, sitting on a mossy log, his quill scratching out the coordinates of a particularly fine specimen near the Saco River. The forest is quiet, the wind is sighing through the canopy, and the king's broad arrow is slowly being swallowed by the growing bark. Chapter 12. The Paperweight Guardians of the Victorian Civil Service. We are moving away from the rugged, pine-scented air of the colonies and into the heart of the 19th century British Empire, London. Specifically, we are entering the hallowed, slightly musty halls of Her Majesty's Stationery Office, or the HMSO. If you think the Qing salt permits were intense, they were a mere warm-up for the Victorian British civil service. This was a world that didn't just run on paper, it ran on the standardization of paper. We are following a senior clerk named Mr. Barnaby, a man whose entire life was governed by the GSM, grams per square meter, of a sheet of foolscap. In the mid-1800s, the British Empire was expanding at a rate that the human mind could barely comprehend. But Mr. Barnaby didn't care about maps or territories. He cared about the weight of the message. You see, the HMSO was responsible for providing every nib, every bottle of ink, and every single sheet of paper used by every government official from Jamaica to Hong Kong. To prevent chaos, Mr. Barnaby had to ensure that an official report from the Department of Woods and Forests was written on the exact same grade of cream-laid paper as a memorandum from the Admiralty. Mr. Barnaby's day began with the tensile test.
He would sit in a small windowless room filled with specialized machines designed to measure the strength of paper fibers. He would take a strip of paper, clamp it into a brass device, and slowly, very slowly, turn a crank until the paper snapped. He would then record the exact pressure required to break the fiber in a ledger with the title Weekly Durability Audits. It was a study in the breaking point of the mundane. The bureaucracy of the HMSO was a masterpiece of Victorian compartmentalization. There was a specific weight of paper for external correspondence, a slightly lighter weight for internal minutes, and a very thin, almost translucent paper for overland mail to India to save on postage costs. Mr. Barnaby spent his afternoons with a set of jeweler's scales, weighing stacks of 10 sheets to ensure the mill in Kent hadn't cheated the government out of a fraction of an ounce of pulp. Then there was the ink absorption index. Mr. Barnaby would place a single drop of official government-issue iron gall ink onto a test sheet and watch it through a magnifying glass. He wasn't looking for the color, he was timing how long it took for the ink to move from a liquid state to a permanent part of the paper's history. If it dried too fast, the paper was too porous. If it took too long, it was too slick. Mr. Barnaby lived in the Goldilocks zone of paper saturation. The most hypnotic part of Barnaby's job was the watermark inspection. Every sheet of official paper had to have a watermark to prevent forgery. He would spend hours standing by a tall north-facing window, holding sheets up to the gray London light. He would look for the subtle outline of the crown or the initials of the reigning monarch. He would do this thousands of weeks, a silent, translucent parade of royal symbols passing before his eyes. It was a rhythmic, visual meditation on the transparency of power. The HMSO also regulated the stationery requisition forms. If a junior clerk in the Treasury wanted a new box of steel nibs, he had to fill out a form that was, ironically, longer than the box of nibs itself. Mr. Barnaby would review these forms with a critical eye. He would look for extravagance. Did the clerk really need extra fine nibs, or would medium suffice? He would write long, polite, and incredibly boring letters of inquiry to departments that were using too much blotting paper. To Mr. Barnaby, a used sheet of blotting paper was a historical document of waste. There was a particular irony in the archival grade paper. This was the heavy, expensive vellum-like paper reserved for treaties and acts of Parliament. Mr. Barnaby treated this paper with the same reverence the Qing tea tasters gave to the pre-rain buds. He would touch it only with white cotton gloves, checking for foxing, the tiny brown spots caused by age and damp. He was the guardian of the empire's future history, ensuring that the paper used to sign the laws of the land wouldn't crumble for at least 500 years. As the London fog rolled in and the gas lights were lit, Mr. Barnaby would tidy his desk. He would align his pens, cap his inkwell, and place his paperweight ledger in the safe. He was a man who found deep soul-level comfort in the fact that every department of the British Empire was using the exact same weight of foolscap. It gave him a sense of unity that no flag could provide.
We'll leave Mr. Barnaby now, as he puts on his coat and hat, his fingers still faintly stained with the blue-black ink of the civil service. The machines are silent, the paper is stacked, and the weight of the empire is precisely what it was supposed to be this morning. Chapter 13. The Vertical Silence of the Atlantic Soundings. We are leaving the dry, ink-stained offices of London and returning to the sea. But we aren't looking at the surface. We are looking down. We are entering the world of the 19th century Coast Survey and the deep-sea sounding parties. This was a time when the world was obsessed with the idea of the transatlantic telegraph cable, but before they could lay the wire, they had to understand the bottom of the ocean. And in the 1850s, the only way to do that was to drop a very long piece of string with a piece of lead on the end of it. This was a task of supreme vertical monotony. We follow a survey officer named Lieutenant Maori. His entire existence was defined by the lead line. Imagine standing on the deck of a slow-moving steamship in the middle of the Atlantic. The engines are throttled back to a low, rhythmic throb. The world is nothing but gray water and gray sky. Maori's job was to oversee the deep-sea cast, a process that could take an entire afternoon just to measure one single point on the map. The equipment was deceptively simple, but required a bureaucracy of physical effort. They used a specialized sounding machine, a heavy brass reel loaded with miles of slender silk or hemp twine. At the end was the sounding lead, a heavy weight with a hollow base filled with tallow or animal fat. The purpose of the fat was to bring back a physical sample of the bottom, a few grains of sand, a bit of crushed shell, or a smear of gray ooze. The cast began with the drop. The lead was released, and the line would scream off the reel. But as it sank deeper, the resistance of the water would slow the line down. Maori would stand with a stopwatch, recording the time it took for every 100-fathom mark to pass his fingers. He wasn't looking for drama, he was looking for the subtle change in the feel of the line that signaled it had hit the floor 2 miles below. The weight was the heart of the job. Once the lead was down, the recovery began. This was the part that tested the soul. Because the line was so long and the water pressure so high, they couldn't just pull it up by hand. They had to use a small, temperamental steam winch that moved at the speed of a walking tortoise. For 3 hours, the only sound on deck would be the clack, clack, clack of the winch and the steady drip of salt water from the returning twine. Maori would sit in a wooden chair, his ledger open on his knees, recording the retrieval log. He noted the angle of the line, the drift of the ship, and the exact minute each fathom marker broke the surface. It was a life lived in vertical increments. If the line snapped, which it often did, the entire afternoon was a write-off. No anger, no shouting, just a quiet entry in the logbook. Line parted at 1,400 fathoms. Gear lost. Will reset. When the lead finally reached the surface, the bottom analysis began. Maori would take a small silver knife and scrape the tallow out of the base of the lead. He would spread the sample onto a glass slide and examine it. To anyone else, it was just mud. To Maori, it was Globigerina ooze, the microscopic remains of tiny sea creatures that had been settling on the ocean floor for millions of years. He would describe the color, the texture, and the smell of the abyss in his report, using terms like light brownish gray or fine-grained calcareous silt. The bureaucracy of the Coast Survey required these samples to be bottled, labeled with the exact latitude and longitude, and sent back to Washington or London. There were warehouses filled with thousands of tiny glass vials, each containing a thimbleful of the Atlantic floor. It was a library of the deep, a collection of the world's most remote dirt. The true boredom lay in the grid work. To map the telegraph route, they couldn't just take one measurement, they had to take hundreds, spaced exactly 5 miles apart. The ship would steam for 30 minutes, stop, drop the lead, wait 4 hours, pull it up, and then move 5 miles to the next spot. It was a life of stop and go that lasted for months. The sailors would spend their time carving scrimshaw out of whale teeth or simply staring at the horizon, while Maori continued his endless arithmetic of depth. There is something profoundly peaceful about the idea of a man spending his life trying to touch the bottom of the world with a piece of string. It was a bridge of twine between the air and the ooze. Maori's maps didn't show islands or coastlines, they showed the telegraphic plateau, a vast, flat, and featureless plain of mud that he had discovered 1 fathom at a time. As the sun sets over the Atlantic, the winch finally stops, the last sample is bottled, the lead is secured, and the ship begins its slow crawl toward the next coordinate.
Maury closes his ledger, the pages slightly damp and smelling of salt. He is a man who knows the secrets of the dark, but he describes them with the clinical boredom of a grocery clerk. The ocean is deep, the line is long, and the mud is exactly where it was yesterday. We'll leave Maury now in his cramped cabin, his lamp swaying gently with the swell of the sea. He's calculating the average slope of the seabed between 45 and 50 degrees west. It's a calculation that will take him until dawn. Chapter 14. The Celestial Arithmetic of the Royal Observatory. We are moving away from the damp, salt-sprayed decks of the sounding ships and returning to the solid, silent stone of Greenwich. We are entering the world of the Royal Observatory in the late 19th century, a place where the stars were not seen as romantic wonders, but as data points to be harvested, cleaned, and filed away in massive leather-bound ledgers. We are following a human computer, a man named Mr. Henderson, whose entire existence was defined by the grueling, slow-motion task of manual lunar distance calculations.
In the days before digital processors, a computer was a job title, not a machine. Mr. Henderson sat in a room with 5 other men, all of them hunched over desks that were perpetually covered in the fine, gray dust of pencil shavings. Their goal was to produce the Nautical Almanac, a book of tables that allowed sailors to find their longitude at sea. To create these tables, Henderson had to predict the position of the moon relative to the sun and stars for every 3-hour interval of the coming 3 years. It was a task that required the precision of a jeweler and the patience of a mountain. The work began with the observation logs from the transit telescope. These were long lists of numbers, right ascension and declination, recorded by the astronomers in the cold, drafty domes upstairs. Henderson would take these numbers and begin the process of reduction. He wasn't looking at the sky, he was looking at logarithms. He had to account for atmospheric refraction, the curvature of the Earth, and the slight annoying wobble of the moon's orbit. Each calculation involved hundreds of additions and subtractions, performed with a quill pen on large sheets of specialized computation paper. The sound in the computing room was a study in Victorian stillness. The only noise was the rhythmic scratch-scratch or pins, the occasional heavy sigh of a man who had discovered a carrying error 4 pages back, and the steady, relentless ticking of the regulator clock on the wall. The clock was the heartbeat of the building, a reminder that while the men were slow, time was constant. Mr. Henderson's world was a narrow corridor of numbers, a landscape of sines and cosines that stretched toward an infinite horizon. The bureaucracy of the observatory was designed to prevent the one thing the British Empire feared most, a typo. To ensure the almanac was perfect, every calculation was performed by 2 different computers working in separate rooms. At the end of the week, Henderson and his counterpart, Mr. Wallace, would meet to collate. They would read their results aloud to each other. If their numbers matched to the 6th decimal place, the result was accepted. If there was a discrepancy of a single digit, both men had to go back to the beginning of the week and recalculate every single step. It was a system that treated human error like a contagious disease. There was a particular sleepy rhythm to the lunar distance tables. The moon moves across the sky at a rate that is perceptible but never hurried. Henderson's job was to track that motion with mathematical certainty. He would spend months on a single month of the moon's life. He knew the moon's habits better than he knew his own family's. He knew its perigee and its apogee, its ascending node and its libration. To him, the moon wasn't a silver orb of poetry. It was a stubborn, fluctuating variable in a very long equation. The most hypnotic part of the work was the proofreading of the plates. Once the tables were calculated and checked, they were sent to the printer to be set in lead type. The proofs would come back to the observatory, and Henderson would have to read them against his original manuscripts.
He would use a magnifying glass and a wooden pointer, moving down the columns of tiny 6-point type. 6024, 6027, 6029. It was a visual marathon. If a single 3 was accidentally flipped into an 8 by a tired typesetter, a ship might end up on the rocks off the coast of Australia. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, but the work itself was incredibly, beautifully light on excitement. As the years passed, Mr. Henderson's world became increasingly abstract. He began to see the universe as a giant clockwork machine made of numbers. The stars were fixed constants, the planets were predictable gears, and he was the man who kept the records of the machine's performance. He found a deep, quiet satisfaction in the residuals, the tiny differences between where a star was predicted to be and where it actually was. To a normal person, a residual was a failure. To Henderson, it was a piece of information to be logged and filed. As the sun set over the Thames and the London fog crept up the hill toward Greenwich, Henderson would finally put down his pen. He would stretch his stiff fingers, rub his tired eyes, and look out the window at the actual moon rising over the trees. He didn't see the man in the moon. He saw a 3-hour interval of longitude. He would then close his ledger, place his pencil in its tray, and walk home in the dark, his mind still humming with the silent celestial arithmetic of the night. We'll leave Mr. Henderson now as he locks the door to the computing room. The stars are out, the moon is on schedule, and the nautical almanac is one day closer to completion. The universe is in its place, and the paperwork is perfectly in order. Chapter 15. The Drafting Tables of the Imperial Patent Office. We are descending from the celestial heights of Greenwich and returning to the soot-stained streets of Victorian London, but our destination is a place of strictly terrestrial precision, the Patent Office. If the Royal Observatory was the memory of the stars, the Patent Office was the catalogue of human ambition, rendered in fine lines of Indian ink. We are following a senior examiner named Mr. Thistlethwaite, a man whose entire existence was dedicated to the visual audit of technical drawings, specifically the infinitely complex world of steam engine valves. In the mid to late 1800s, the world was exploding with mechanical ingenuity. Everyone, from country blacksmiths to university professors, believed they had invented a slightly more efficient way to regulate the flow of high-pressure steam. But before they could claim their fortune, they had to submit their designs to Mr. Thistlethwaite. He was the filter through which all progress had to pass, and his filter was made of the finest grain tracing paper and the most cynical of spirits. Mr. Thistlethwaite's day began not with a machine, but with a preliminary filing. A heavy cardboard-backed envelope would land on his desk containing a set of blueprints. He would open it with a silver letter opener and unfold the drawings with a practiced rhythmic slowness. He wasn't looking for the genius of the invention. He was looking for drafting irregularities. Were the cross-sections properly hatched? Were the scale bars accurate to the 16th of an inch? If a line was a hair too thick, or if a label was written in non-standard script, the entire patent was stayed.
The sound in the Patent Office was a muted chorus of scraping chairs and the dry, papery rustle of blueprints being rolled and unrolled. Mr. Thistlethwaite's world was a landscape of Section AA and isometric view. He spent hours bent over a drafting table, using a specialized parallel ruler to verify that the inventor's claims of symmetry weren't just hopeful thinking. He was the arbiter of the straight line, a man who lived in a world where a curve was a mathematical commitment. The bureaucracy of the Patent Office was a labyrinth of prior art. For every new valve design, Thistlethwaite had to search the archives, those same silent, dusty rooms we visited before, to ensure that no one in 1842 had already invented a similar slide valve with auxiliary port.
This meant he spent his afternoons looking at drawings of things that had never been built, comparing them to drawings of things that might never be built. It was a history of shadows and blueprints. One of the most hypnotic aspects of his job was the specification check. Every drawing was accompanied by a written description that used a very specific, very legalistic vocabulary. Thistlethwaite would read these descriptions aloud to himself in a low, monotone hum. The aforementioned piston, having reached its zenith of stroke, shall engage the cam lever marked figure 3. He would check every word against the drawing, moving his finger from the text to the diagram and back again. It was a rhythmic, ocular exercise that lasted for hours. There was a particular irony in the novelty search. To find something new, Thistlethwaite had to become an expert in everything old. He knew more about the evolution of the screw thread than the men who made them. He knew the precise year the eccentric linkage had reached its peak of complexity. He was a historian of the nuts and bolts, a man who understood the empire not as a collection of colonies, but as a collection of interlocking mechanical parts. The models room was the only place where the paperwork took physical form. For certain patents, inventors had to submit small-scale working models made of brass and mahogany. Thistlethwaite would visit this room once a week to validate the mechanism. He would turn a tiny crank with his thumb and forefinger, watching the miniature valves open and close with a soft metallic click-clack. He would do this for hours, his face reflecting the dull gleam of the brass. It was a silent, miniature world of perfect repetition. As the gas lights flickered and the office began to empty, Mr. Thistlethwaite would carefully roll up his blueprints and secure them with a red ribbon, the red tape that has become the symbol of his profession. He would place his magnifying glass in its velvet-lined box and wipe his parallel ruler with a piece of chamois leather. He was a man who found peace in the fact that every invention, no matter how revolutionary, could be reduced to a series of two-dimensional lines on a piece of paper. We'll leave Mr. Thistlethwaite now, as he puts on his galoshes and prepares to walk into the London rain. The valves are closed, the steam is contained, and the blueprints are filed away in the great registry of human effort. Everything is in its place, and every line is perfectly straight. Chapter 16. The Luminous Ledger of the Lighthouse Keepers. We're leaving the cramped mechanical silence of the patent office and heading back to the coast, specifically to the lonely, wind-swept outposts of the Trinity House and the Board of Trade. If Mr. Thistlethwaite managed the steam of the interior, our new protagonist, a Board of Trade clerk named Mr. Sterling, managed the light of the exterior. We are entering the world of lighthouse logistics, a department where the primary objective was to ensure that the flame of civilization never flickered, provided that the flickering was properly documented in a 3-part carbon copy ledger. In the late 1800s, the coast of the British Isles was dotted with stone towers, each a beacon of safety for the merchant fleet. But these beacons ran on something very physical, very heavy, and very expensive: colza oil, and later paraffin. Mr. Sterling's job was to track the consumption of this oil down to the last fluid ounce. He lived in a world of burn rates and wick maintenance schedules, a landscape where the primary unit of time was the watch glass. Mr. Sterling's day began with the consumption audit. Every week, a heavy, weather-beaten logbook would arrive from a lighthouse, perhaps the Edstone or the lonely Bell Rock. Inside, the lighthouse keeper had recorded the exact time the lamp was lit, the exact time it was extinguished, and the measurement of the oil reservoir before and after the shift. Mr. Sterling would take his ruler and verify the math. If the keeper used a pint more oil on a Tuesday than he did on a Monday, Mr. Sterling would draft a query of variance. The bureaucracy of the light was as thick as a channel fog. Every lighthouse had an inventory of consumables. This didn't just include oil, it included the number of cotton wicks used, the amount of silver polish required for the reflectors, and even the quantity of soap to wash the salt spray off the massive glass panes of the lantern room.
Mr. Sterling spent his afternoons comparing the soap usage of the Lizard Lighthouse against the soap usage of the longships. He was looking for statistical anomalies, which usually just meant a keeper was being particularly diligent with a sponge. The most hypnotic part of Sterling's work was the oil tender manifest. Twice a year, a heavy, weather-beaten ship would visit the remote stations. Mr. Sterling had to coordinate the loading of hundreds of heavy iron drums of oil. He would sit at his desk, surrounded by tide tables and coastal charts, calculating the window of delivery. If the sea was too rough, the tender couldn't land, the oil couldn't be delivered, and the light would eventually go out. But to Sterling, the tragedy wasn't the potential shipwreck. The tragedy was the disrupted supply chain.
One of the most delicate aspects of the job was the lens maintenance report. The massive Fresnel lenses, made of hundreds of hand-ground glass prisms, were masterpieces of physics. They had to be rotated on a bed of liquid mercury to ensure a frictionless, perfectly timed flash. Mr. Sterling had to track the purity of the mercury. He would read reports from keepers who had noticed a slight drag in the rotation, and he would authorize the purchase of a specific weight of refined mercury, recording the transaction in the mechanical integrity ledger. The sound in Sterling's office was the soft, persistent scratching of a steel nib on heavy vellum. It was the sound of a man trying to turn the chaotic, wild energy of the Atlantic Ocean into a series of predictable columns. He knew the name of every keeper, the height of every tower, and the exact diameter of every wick. He was a man who saw the coast not as a place of beauty, but as a series of maintenance requirements. There was a particular peace in the winter forecasts. As the nights grew longer, the oil consumption naturally increased. Mr. Sterling would adjust his spreadsheets, predicting the peak demand for the month of December. He would sit by his own small fireplace in London, looking at a map of the dark, crashing coastline, and find comfort in the knowledge that because of his paperwork, every lamp was full, every wick was trimmed, and every prism was polished. As the office clock struck 5, Mr. Sterling would close his Lighthouse Expenditure Journal. He would blot the final entry, clean his pen, and place his spectacles in their leather case. He was a man who understood that the safety of the world's sailors didn't depend on heroism, but on the meticulous recording of oil levels in a damp stone tower miles from shore. We'll leave Mr. Sterling now, as he steps out into the evening mist. The lights are being lit all along the coast, their long white fingers of light sweeping across the waves in a perfectly timed 6-second interval. The oil is flowing, the mercury is spinning, and the Board of Trade has everything under control. Chapter 17. The Statistical Stillness of the Census Office. We are retreating from the wind-swept coast and returning to the dense, quiet heart of London, into a building that housed the very essence of the British population, the Census Office. If Mr. Sterling managed the lights of the sea, our new guide, Mr. Pringle, managed the tally of the souls. We are entering the world of the 1881 census, a massive, decade-spanning undertaking where the primary goal was to turn every living person into a single, neat stroke of a pen. Mr. Pringle was a tabulator. His life was not lived in years or months, but in enumeration districts. Once every 10 years, the entire machinery of the empire ground to a halt so that every head could be counted. But for Pringle, the actual counting was the fast part. The real work, the slow, rhythmic, mind-numbing work, was the classification. Thousands of leather bags filled with paper forms would arrive at the office, smelling of the villages they had come from, sheep wool from the Cotswolds, coal dust from Wales, and the salt air of the docks. Pringle's day began with the occupational sort.
He would take a stack of forms and read the handwritten entries under the column rank, profession, or occupation. It was a linguistic landscape of the mundane. He wasn't looking for doctors or lawyers, they were easy. He was looking for the ag labs, agricultural laborers, the piecers, the scavengers, and the knocker-ups. He had to take these thousands of disparate titles and group them into the official categories defined by the Registrar General. The bureaucracy of the census was a masterpiece of Victorian categorization. There were 403 official classes. Mr. Pringle spent his mornings with a heavy reference book called the Dictionary of Occupations. If a man wrote that he was a muffin maker, Pringle had to decide if he belonged in Class 14, makers of articles of food, or if his operation was small enough to be Class 15, purveyors. He would sit with his chin in his hand, weighing the social status of a muffin for 20 minutes before making a single tick mark. The sound in the tabulation room was the soft, persistent flick, flick, flick of paper being turned. It was a room of 200 men, all doing exactly the same thing, their pens moving in a synchronized, slow-motion dance. They used tally sheets, large grids of squares where every fifth stroke was drawn diagonally to signify a group of 5. Pringle would spend 4 hours on one street in Manchester, his world shrinking down to the number of domestic servants living in basement flats. The most hypnotic part of the work was the discrepancy check. Pringle had to ensure that the ages of the children matched the length of the marriage. If a couple had been married for 3 years but had a 7-year-old son, Pringle didn't judge, he simply flagged it for verification. He would cross-reference the entry with the birth registries, a process involving sending a memo to another department and waiting 3 days for a reply. He was a weaver of lives, but he only cared about the threads that didn't quite line up. Then there was the Ages and Conditions report. Pringle had to calculate the average age of a blacksmith in Yorkshire versus a blacksmith in Cornwall. He did this using a summation board, a wooden frame with sliding beads that helped him add thousands of numbers without losing his place. He would slide a bead, make a note, slide a bead, make a note. The click of the beads was the only percussion in his silent statistical world. There was a particular piece in the rural summaries. As Pringle moved through the records of tiny, forgotten hamlets, he felt like he was walking through a ghost town. He would see a village where everyone was a grazer or a lace worker. He would record the population of 300 people, knowing that by the time he finished his report, some of them would be gone, and others would be born. He was capturing a heartbeat in amber. As the afternoon sun hit the dusty ledgers, Mr. Pringle would begin the final totals for his district. This was the moment of truth. If his columns didn't add up to the number provided by the local enumerator, he had to start the entire district over. He would take a deep breath, adjust his spectacles, and begin the recount. It was a life of double-checking the obvious.
When the clock finally struck 6, Mr. Pringle would blot his final tally sheet. He would stack his forms, tie them with a piece of hemp twine, and place them in the completed bin. He was a man who understood that the strength of the nation wasn't found in its speeches or its wars, but in the fact that it could accurately account for every one of its 26 million inhabitants. He felt a quiet pride in the fact that, because of him, the muffin maker of Stepney was officially a part of the British Empire's grand design. We'll leave Mr. Pringle now, as he steps out into the cool evening air. The city is full of people, people walking, people shouting, people living. But to Pringle, they are all just tick marks waiting to happen. The census is almost finished, the numbers are nearly balanced, and the population is exactly where it ought to be. Chapter 18. The Rhythmic Gauging of the Excise Barrels.
We are leaving the quiet statistical cloisters of the census office and moving into the much more humid, pungent, and echoing world of the 19th century excise office. Specifically, we are descending into the cool limestone cellars of a large London brewery. Here, the primary objective was not the enjoyment of the ale, but the precise measurement of its volume. We are following an excise officer named Mr. Holloway, a man whose life was a series of mathematical dips into the deep, dark sea of British beer. In the mid-Victorian era, the tax on malt and beer was a pillar of the national budget. To ensure the crown received its due, every barrel produced by a brewery had to be gauged. This wasn't a matter of guessing, it was a matter of geometry. Mr. Holloway didn't see a barrel as a vessel of refreshment. He saw it as a frustum of a spheroid. His job was to calculate the exact capacity of these bulging wooden containers, accounting for the thickness of the oak staves and the curvature of the belly. Mr. Holloway's day began with the dipping. He carried a gauging rod, a long, square staff of boxwood tipped with brass and graduated to the 1/10 of an inch. He would approach a massive vat, some of which held thousands of gallons, and slowly lower the rod through a small port in the top. He had to be careful not to create a ripple. He would hold the rod steady for exactly 10 seconds, then pull it out and read the wet inch marked on the wood. The sound in the cellar was a constant dripping hollow. The air was thick with the smell of fermenting yeast and damp sawdust. Mr. Holloway would move from barrel to barrel, his boots echoing on the wet stone. For each one, he had to perform the cross measurement. He would measure the diameter of the head, the diameter of the bung, the widest part of the barrel, and the length. He would then consult a set of logarithmic slide rules specifically designed for excise work. He would slide the brass scales back and forth, his lips moving in a silent recitation of cubic inches. The bureaucracy of the excise office was famously rigid. Mr. Holloway carried a stock book, a leather-bound volume that was chain-stitched to prevent pages from being removed. In this book, he recorded the charge, the amount of tax owed on each batch. If his calculations differed from the brewer's own records by more than 0.5%, he had to launch a secondary verification. This involved emptying a barrel into a standardized copper vessel to prove its volume, a process that took 4 hours and involved 6 different people watching water move from one container to another. The most hypnotic part of the work was the wort inspection. Before the beer was fermented, it was a sugary liquid called wort. The tax was based on its specific gravity. Mr. Holloway would take a sample in a tall glass cylinder and float a saccharometer, a delicate brass instrument with a weighted bulb, into the liquid. He would wait for the instrument to stop bobbing, then stoop down until his eye was level with the meniscus of the liquid. He would record the density, accounting for the temperature of the room using a mercury thermometer. It was a delicate, silent observation of a floating piece of metal. There was a particular sleepy rhythm to the cellar walk. A large brewery could have 5,000 barrels in storage. Mr. Holloway had to chalk each one he had measured. By the end of the day, his coat would be white with chalk dust, and his ears would be ringing with the sound of the coopers' hammers in the distance. He was a man who understood the empire as a series of taxable fluids, a guardian of the treasury who lived in a world of constant low-level dampness. As the sun set and the gas lights were lit in the brewery yard, Mr. Holloway would return to his small office. He would sit at his desk and cast the totals. He would add up the gallons, the half-gallons, and the quarts, then multiply the total by the current tax rate. He would do this 3 times to ensure there were no errors. He found a deep rhythmic comfort in the fact that the liquid in the barrels was now officially accounted for. It was no longer just beer, it was revenue. We'll leave Mr. Holloway now
as he cleans his gauging rod with a piece of soft flannel. The cellar is dark, the beer is still, and the crown's portion has been measured to the 1/10 of an inch. Everything is in its place, and the ledgers are perfectly balanced. Chapter 19. The Fractional Arithmetic of the Post Office Savings Bank. We are moving out of the damp, yeasty shadows of the brewery and into the stark, brightly lit, and incredibly quiet halls of the Post Office Savings Bank headquarters in London. If Mr. Holloway measured the density of beer, Mr. Smedley measured the density of the working man's penny. We are entering a world of massive, tall-backed desks and the endless scratching chorus of the ledger branch, where the primary objective was the calculation of interest on the smallest imaginable sums of money.
The Post Office Savings Bank was a Victorian marvel designed to encourage thrift among the lower classes. It allowed people to deposit as little as a shilling. But while the deposits were small, the bureaucracy required to manage them was gargantuan. Mr. Smedley was a junior auditor, and his entire reality was defined by the halfpenny calculation. In the 1880s, the interest rate was fixed at 2.5% per annum. This meant that for every pound sterling, the depositor earned 6 pence a year, or a halfpenny per month for every complete pound. Mr. Smedley's day began with a stack of deposit books that had been sent in from post offices across the country, from the Highlands of Scotland to the tiny villages of Cornwall. He would open a book, perhaps belonging to a chimney sweep or a scullery maid, and look at the columns of small handwritten figures. He wasn't looking for wealth, he was looking for the static minimum. Interest was only paid on full pounds that had stayed in the account for a full calendar month. If a depositor had 19 shillings and 11 pence, Mr. Smedley took a grim, rhythmic satisfaction in awarding them exactly 0 interest. The sound in the ledger branch was a unique acoustic environment. It was the sound of 300 men breathing in unison, punctuated only by the thump of a rubber stamp and the occasional rustle of a giant ledger page being turned. These ledgers were so large they required a specialized pulley system to be moved from the archives to the desks. Mr. Smedley spent his mornings posting the interest. He would take a long wooden ruler, align it with a customer's account number, and calculate the monthly increment. The bureaucracy of the bank was obsessed with the penny balance. At the end of every quarter, the entire department had to reach a general reconciliation. Every single halfpenny of interest awarded across millions of accounts had to be totaled and compared against the Central Treasury's figures. If the balance was off by even a single penny, no one was allowed to go home. Mr. Smedley spent many a long evening under a green-shaded lamp, his eyes blurring as he re-added columns of figures that were 3 feet long. The most hypnotic part of the work was the verification of the stamp. Every deposit was verified by a unique physical stamp from the local postmaster. Mr. Smedley had to inspect these stamps for clarity and authenticity. He would move his magnifying glass over the page, checking the date and the location code. Birmingham 12, Oct. 84. It was a silent, repetitive travelogue of the British Isles, conducted through the medium of purple ink and serrated paper. There was a particular piece in the dormant accounts. These were books that hadn't seen a deposit in years. Mr. Smedley would still have to calculate the interest, year after year, adding a few pence to a balance that would likely never be claimed. He felt like a caretaker of a tiny, growing forest of copper coins. He knew the names of people he would never meet, people whose entire life savings amounted to the cost of a good pair of boots, and he treated their halfpennies with the same clinical gravity as if they were bars of bullion. As the afternoon light faded and the gas lights began to hiss, Mr. Smedley would perform his final task, the inkwell sealing. He would clean his steel nibs with a scrap of felt, close his ledger, and lock it with a heavy brass key.
He was a man who understood that the stability of the empire rested on the fact that even the poorest citizen could trust the government to accurately calculate a half penny. It was a world where trust was built on a foundation of perfect, boring arithmetic. We'll leave Mr. Smedley now, as he puts on his bowler hat and prepares for the train ride home. The ledgers are locked, the interest is posted, and the working man's pennies are exactly 1/2 penny richer than they were last month. Everything is in its place, and the national economy is perfectly balanced. Chapter 20. The leaf-by-leaf humidity of the customs warehouse. We are departing the sterile mathematical silence of the savings bank and returning to the heavy aromatic atmosphere of the London docks. We are entering the King Victoria tobacco warehouse, a sprawling brick monolith that held enough nicotine to keep the entire continent awake for a century. But inside, the mood was anything but energetic. We are following a customs officer named Mr. Holloway, a man whose entire life was dedicated to the manual moisture audit of imported tobacco. In the late 19th century, the duty on tobacco was calculated by weight. However, the Board of Customs was acutely aware of a very specific kind of atmospheric fraud: moisture. If a merchant allowed his tobacco leaves to become damp, they weighed more, and he paid more tax. Conversely, if the leaves were too dry, they crumbled, losing value. Mr. Holloway was the arbiter of this delicate, soggy balance. He lived in a world of hogsheads, massive wooden barrels packed with thousands of compressed tobacco leaves. Mr. Holloway's day began with the core sample. He carried a long, hollow steel tube known as a tobacco spike. He would approach a hogshead and with a slow, steady pressure drive the spike into the center of the compressed mass. He didn't rush. A fast strike would generate heat, and heat would evaporate the very moisture he was trying to measure. Then he would withdraw the spike, revealing a long, variegated cylinder of brown and gold leaves. The sound in the warehouse was a low, muffled thud of barrels being rolled and the distant, rhythmic ticking of the master clock. Mr. Holloway would take his core sample to a small glass-enclosed station known as the hygroscopic booth. Here, the air was kept at perfectly constant temperature. He would take a handful of the leaves and perform the crush test. He would squeeze the leaves in his palm and then slowly open his hand. If the leaves sprang back immediately, they were springy, low moisture. If they stayed matted, they were deadened, high moisture. He lived in a world of shades of mildew, knowing that the streak of slightly grayer leaves could signal a defense in a future tax claim.
We remain in the glass-enclosed silence of the hygroscopic booth with Mr. Holloway. As we noted, the crush test was merely the preamble to the true scientific monotony of the customs house. To satisfy the Board of Customs, Mr. Holloway had to perform the official desiccation. This was a process that turned the vibrant, aromatic tobacco leaf into a series of decimal points representing lost water. Mr. Holloway would take exactly 1 ounce of the sampled tobacco and place it into a small numbered porcelain crucible. He would then slide this crucible into a low-temperature drying oven, a bain-marie for bureaucracy. The tobacco wasn't scorched, it was gently coaxed of its moisture over the course of 4 hours. During this time, Mr. Holloway sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on a slow-moving sand glass, recording the oven entry time in a ledger titled The Register of Aqueous Content. When the sand had run its course, the crucible was removed and placed under the glass dome of the analytical balance. Mr. Holloway would add tiny brass milligram weights with a pair of silver tweezers until the scale leveled. The difference between the green weight and the dry weight told him exactly how much of the merchant's cargo was actually water. If a hogshead was found to have a moisture content of 14.2% instead of the declared 12%, a debit note for excess vapor was issued. It was a world where a humid afternoon in the Caribbean 3 months prior could result in a 4-hour mathematical audit in London. The sound in the booth was the delicate clink of the tweezers and the scratching of the quill. Mr. Holloway's world was a constant calculation of ratios. He had to adjust his findings based on the ambient humidity of the Thames, a figure he obtained by checking hygrometer every hour on the hour. He would plot these figures on a large hand-drawn graph on the wall, creating a visual history of the air in the warehouse. The bureaucracy of the tobacco trade was a closed loop of inspection. Once the moisture was determined, the tobacco was repacked into the hogsheads. But it couldn't just be thrown back in. A packing overseer had to witness the replacement of the core sample to ensure that no dry leaf was being substituted for wet leaf to cheat the next day's audit. Mr. Holloway would sign the seal of re-entry, a small paper strip pasted over the bung of the barrel. There was a particular sleepy piece in the stemming room. In this part of the warehouse, long-term residents of the city, usually elderly men with incredible patience, would sit on low stools and manually strip the thick central stems from the leaves. These stems were taxed at a lower rate than the leaf itself. Mr. Holloway had to weigh the piles of stems separately, ensuring the ratio of stem to lamina was consistent with the botanical standards of Virginia or Kentucky. He would walk through the room, his boots crunching softly on the discarded bits of plant, his clipboard ever present. As the fog thickened outside the warehouse windows, turning the Thames into a gray void, Mr. Holloway would begin his daily recalibration. He would clean his crucibles with a soft cloth, polish the brass weights of his scales, and lock the register of aqueous content in a fireproof safe. He was a man who understood that the wealth of the empire was not just in its trade, but in its ability to distinguish between the value of a leaf and the weight of the air it breathed. There was a particular piece in the trial of the picks preparation. Once a year, the mint's work was audited by an independent jury. Arkwright was responsible for selecting the random samples that would be locked in the picks chest. He would choose one coin from every 1,000, placing it in a small linen bag and sealing it with red wax. He treated these coins like sacred relics, ensuring that the bags were labeled with a level of calligraphic detail that would make the Qing archivists proud. As the London sun set, reflecting off the millions of pounds of gold in the vaults, Mr. Arkwright would perform his final die clearance. He would wipe his brass gauges with a chamois cloth and lock his magnifying glass in a mahogany box. He was a man who understood that the value of money wasn't just in the metal, but in the mathematical perfection of its shape. He found a deep, soul-level comfort in the fact that every sovereign in a sailor's pocket was exactly as round and as ridged as the one before it. Chapter 23. The incremental verticality of the contour clerks. We are leaving the gleam of the mint and heading out into the open air, though our perspective remains fixed on the minute. We are entering the field offices of the Ordnance Survey in the 1890s. If Mr. Arkwright measured the edges of a coin, our new protagonist, Mr. Willoughby, measured the curves of the earth. We are entering the world of the contour trace, a discipline where the primary objective was to turn the rolling hills of England into a series of perfectly concentric, brown-inked lines. Mr. Willoughby was a topographic draftsman. While surveyors were out in the wind and rain with their theodolites and chains, Willoughby sat in a quiet room in Southampton surrounded by level books. These books contained thousands of individual height measurements, known as spot heights, taken every few yards across the landscape. Willoughby's job was the interpolation, the slow, artistic, and mathematically rigorous process of connecting these dots to reveal the shape of the land.
Mr. Willoughby's day began with the grid square. He would take a large sheet of high-quality vellum, already printed with a faint blue grid. Using a proportional divider, he would mark the spot heights onto the sheet. He wasn't just drawing, he was performing a spatial translation. If one point was 150 feet above sea level and the next was 160 feet, he had to calculate exactly where the 155-foot contour line should pass between them, assuming a constant slope. The sound in the drafting room was the soft, rhythmic hiss of a ruling pen and the occasional puff of breath as a clerk blew away a stray speck of dust. Mr. Willoughby used a contour pen, a specialized tool with a swiveling nib that allowed him to draw long, winding lines without the ink pooling or the line width changing. He would lean over the table, his nose inches from the vellum, following the invisible logic of the terrain. He spent his mornings tracing the 200-foot line, a journey that might take him 3 miles of paper countryside, but only 6 inches of actual desk space. The bureaucracy of the Ordnance Survey was a masterpiece of positional accuracy. Every map sheet had to be edge-matched. This meant that the contour lines on the right side of sheet 42 had to meet the lines on the left side of sheet 43 with a precision of less than 1/100th of an inch. Mr. Willoughby and his neighbor, Mr. Perkins, would spend hours standing side by side, holding their 2 map sheets together against a window pane, checking that the hills of Derbyshire didn't suddenly jump 10 feet into the air at the border of the page. The most hypnotic part of the work was the hatchuring. For steeper cliffs where contour lines became too crowded to read, Willoughby would use hatchures, tiny short strokes of the pen that indicated the direction and steepness of the slope. A steep cliff required short, thick, closely packed strokes. A gentle slope required long, thin, spaced-out strokes. He would spend an entire afternoon on a single rocky outcrop, his hand moving in a rhythmic tick-tick-tick as he shaded the stone. It was a digital representation of a mountain, created one stroke at a time. There was a particular piece in the verification of watercourses. Willoughby had to ensure that every stream and brook followed the laws of gravity. He would trace the blue lines of the rivers, making sure they always crossed the brown contour lines at the lowest points of the V shapes. If a stream appeared to be flowing uphill, it triggered a discrepancy memo to the field surveyors. He was the guardian of physical reality, a man who ensured that the map was more logical than the land itself. As the evening light turned the vellum to gold, Mr. Willoughby would perform his ink check. He would clean his pens in a jar of water, cap his bottle of burnt sienna ink, and cover his map with a sheet of protective tissue paper. He was a man who understood that a nation was only truly known when it was measured. He found a deep, quiet satisfaction in the fact that because of his work, a traveler could look at a piece of paper and know exactly how much they would have to pant to reach the top of a hill they had never seen. Chapter 24. The Chronometric Pulse of the Admiralty. We leave the rolling hills of the Ordnance Survey and return to the salt-tinged air of the Royal Naval College in Greenwich. We are entering the chronometer section of the Admiralty, the high-precision heart of the British Navy. If Mr. Arkwright measured the Earth's height, our new protagonist, Mr. Horrocks, measured the very fabric of time. We are entering a world of thermal compensation and rate adjustment, a sanctuary of silence where the only allowed vibration was the steady metallic heartbeat of the Empire's finest timepieces. In the 1890s, the safety of every ship in the Royal Navy depended on its marine chronometer, a clock so precise it could keep time to within a fraction of a second over months at sea. But these were temperamental instruments. They were sensitive to temperature,
humidity, and the gentle rocking of the Earth itself. Mr. Horrocks was a chronometer attendant. His job was to oversee the rating,
the slow, year-long process of proving a clock's worth before it was ever allowed to guide a battleship. Mr. Horrocks's day began with the Great Winding. At exactly 9 a.m., he would enter the testing room, a chamber with thick stone walls designed to maintain a constant temperature. He carried a heavy brass key and a velvet cloth. There were hundreds of chronometers, each housed in a mahogany box suspended on gimbals, brass rings that kept the clock level even if the building were to tilt. Horrocks would wind each one with exactly the same number of turns, his movements as steady and predictable as the gears he served. The sound in the room was a symphony of the seconds. Hundreds of escapements, the tiny mechanisms that release the clock's power, were ticking in a dense, overlapping texture of sound. It wasn't a cacophony, it was a rhythmic blanket. Horrocks would move through this soundscape, his ear tuned to the slightest gallop or hesitation in a tick. If a clock sounded tired, it was noted in the diagnostic journal for a complete teardown by the master watchmaker. The bureaucracy of time was a masterpiece of error logging. Every chronometer had a rating sheet. Once a day, at the moment the Greenwich time ball dropped, Horrocks would compare each clock against the master regulator, the most accurate clock in the building. He didn't adjust the chronometers, he merely recorded their rate. If a clock gained 0.4 seconds every day, that was fine, as long as it gained exactly 0.4 seconds every single day. Consistency was more important than absolute truth. The most hypnotic part of the work were the thermal trials. To simulate a voyage from the Arctic to the tropics, the chronometers were placed in the oven, a heated cabinet, for a week, and then the icebox for a week. Horrocks would monitor the thermal error. He would sit by the cabinets, recording the temperature and the corresponding change in the clock's rate. He was looking for the middle temperature error, a subtle mathematical ghost that lived in the expansion and contraction of the balance spring. There was a particular sleepy piece in the oil audit. Every 3 months, the chronometers required a single needle-worth drop of specialized oil, often refined from the jaw fat of a porpoise, on the pivots. Horrocks would use a single needle to apply a droplet so small it was invisible to the naked eye. He would perform this surgery under a jeweler's loupe, his breath held, his world shrinking down to the tip of a steel pivot. It was a life of extreme focus on the infinitesimal. As the evening light faded over the Thames, Mr. Horrocks would perform his final collation. He would average the daily rates for each clock, creating a performance curve on a graph. If a clock passed its year-long trial, it was issued a certificate of Admiralty approval and sent to a ship. Horrocks felt a quiet paternal pride when a clock left his care. He knew that somewhere in the Indian Ocean, a navigator would look at that mahogany box and trust his life to the mathematics Horrocks had verified in a silent room in London. Chapter 25. The Tidal Calculus and the Proofs of the Deep. We are shifting our gaze from the mechanical heartbeat of the chronometer to the rhythmic liquid pulse of the sea. We are entering the offices of the hydrographic department, specifically the tidal branch. If Mr. Horrocks measured time in seconds, our new protagonist, Mr. Abernathy, measured time in the rise and fall of fathoms. We are entering the world of tidal prediction, a discipline where the primary objective was to turn the chaotic movements of the moon and the gravitational pull of the sun into series of reliable printed numbers for the tide tables for British and Irish ports. In the late 19th century, predicting the tide was a feat of high-order harmonic analysis. The ocean didn't just go up and down, it was a complex interference pattern of dozens of different constituents: the solar tide, the lunar tide, the shallow water effect, and the seasonal variations.
Mr. Abernathy was a tidal computer. His job was to take the raw data from tide gauges located at ports from Liverpool to Singapore and verify that the predicted high water matched the reality within a tolerance of 3 inches. Mr. Abernathy's day began with the gauge rolls. These were long strips of paper covered with a continuous squiggly ink line produced by a self-registering tide gauge. A float in a well would rise and fall with the tide, moving a pen across the paper. Abernathy would sit with a parallel scale, measuring the height of the curve at every hour mark. He wasn't just reading a line, he was translating a physical event into a column of digits. He spent his mornings digitizing the Atlantic, 1 ink-smudged millimeter at a time. The sound in the tidal branch was the soft, rhythmic snip-snip of paper being trimmed and the heavy metallic clunk of the Kelvin harmonic analyzer. This was a massive brass and wire mechanical computer that used a system of pulleys and weights to sum up the different tidal components. Abernathy would set the dials for a specific port, adjusting for the local harmonic constants, and then turn a hand crank. The machine would slowly trace the predicted tide for the coming year. It was a masterpiece of Victorian brass-brain technology, and Abernathy was its high priest. The bureaucracy of the tides was a masterpiece of proof correction. Once the predictions were generated, they had to be typeset into tables. This was the most grueling part of Abernathy's life. A single table for a single port contained over 8,000 digits. He would receive the galley proofs from the printer and begin the blind comparison. He and a junior clerk would sit back to back. The clerk would read the numbers from the original manuscript aloud, and Abernathy would follow along on the printed proof. 5.764. If a single decimal point was misplaced, the clerk would be silenced with a sharp "wait," and the audit would restart for that entire page. The most hypnotic part of the work were the meteorological corrections. Tides are influenced by air pressure. A heavy storm can push the water down, while a low-pressure system allows it to rise. Abernathy had to compare his tide logs against the barometric ledger. He spent his afternoons looking for surges, the moments where the water behaved in a way the math couldn't predict. He would note these anomalies in red ink, creating a history of the ocean's moods that would be used to refine the harmonic constants for the next decade.
There was a particular sleepy piece in the port registers. Every port had its own unique establishment of the port, the time delay between the moon passing the meridian and the occurrence of high water. Abernathy knew these delays by heart. He knew that London Bridge was 1 hour and 58 minutes behind the moon, while Portsmouth was 11 hours and 41 minutes. He lived in a world where the geography of the Earth was defined by how long it took for the water to arrive. As the London evening settled and the Thames, just outside his window, began its slow, inevitable retreat toward the sea, Mr. Abernathy would close his harmonic ledger. He would clean the ink from the Kelvin machine's pens and cover the brass pulleys with a silk cloth. He was a man who understood that the safety of the Empire's ships depended on his ability to predict the future of the water. He found a deep, quiet satisfaction in the fact that because of his columns of figures, a captain in the middle of the ocean knew exactly when the mud would become deep enough to sail home. Chapter 26. The Pastoral Ledger of the Ear Tag Inspectors. We are stepping away from the rhythmic liquid calculations of the Thames and moving into the mud-caked, lowing reality of the British countryside. We are entering the world of the Board of Agriculture in the 1890s, specifically the Department of Animal Health. If Mr. Abernathy tracked the movement of the tides, our new guide, Mr. Higgins, tracks the movement of the infected hoof. We are entering a world of sanitary cordons and movement licenses,
where the primary objective was to turn every cow, sheep, and pig in the British Isles into a unique 7-digit entry in a leather-bound book. In the late 19th century, the specter of foot and mouth disease haunted the pastoral economy. To control the spread, the government mandated a level of livestock traceability that bordered on the obsessive. Mr. Higgins was a district veterinary inspector. His life was lived in the holding pens of railway junctions and the larages of regional markets. He didn't see a herd. He saw a collection of mobile biological assets, each requiring a physical audit. Mr. Higgins's day began with the tagging sweep. He would enter a farmyard at dawn, carrying a heavy leather bag filled with official ear tags, small numbered brass discs, and a pair of specialized crimping pliers. One by one, the cattle would be funneled through a wooden crush. As each animal was held still, Higgins would reach in and pierce the ear with a tag. He would then record the number, the breed, the age, and the distinguishing marks, such as a white patch on the left flank, into his inventory of holdings. The sound of the farm was a chaotic mix of bellows, the clatter of hooves on cobbles, and the rhythmic click-snap of the pliers. Mr. Higgins moved with a slow, methodical caution. A startled cow was a threat to his paperwork. He spent his mornings in a state of olfactory bureaucracy, his ledger perpetually smelling of hay, manure, and the carbolic acid he used to disinfect his boots between farms. The bureaucracy of the Board of Agriculture was centered on the movement license. If a farmer wanted to move 10 steers from a pasture in Devon to a market in Somerset, he had to apply for a permit. Higgins would review these applications, checking them against the infection maps on his office wall. He would then issue a transit certificate, a document that had to be carried by the drover and stamped at every municipal boundary. Higgins spent his afternoons chalking the wagons, marking railway cars with a specific code to indicate they had been steam cleaned after carrying livestock. The most hypnotic part of the work was the mouth and foot inspection. In areas under quarantine, every animal had to be examined daily. Higgins would use a wooden speculum to hold an animal's mouth open, looking for the telltale blisters of the disease. He would then lift each hoof, cleaning the interdigital space with a stiff brush to check for lesions. He would perform this check hundreds of times a day, a repetitive, silent ritual of diagnostic touch. He was looking for a zero-case baseline, the beautiful, boring proof that nothing was happening. There was a particular sleepy piece in the fairs and markets audit. At the height of the trading season, Higgins would stand at the gate of a market town, his clipboard in hand. He would count every animal entering the square, cross-referencing their ear tags with the movement licenses. He was the human gatekeeper of the herd, ensuring that the rural economy moved at a pace that the bureaucracy could track. He found a deep, quiet satisfaction in the day where every tag matched every form and not a single blister was found. As the sun set over the hedgerows, Mr. Higgins would return to his lodgings. He would scrub his hands with lye, clean his brass tags with a cloth, and finalize his weekly summary of health. He was a man who understood that the health of the nation was built on the meticulous tracking of millions of individual lives. He felt a quiet pride in the fact that because of his records, a single sick pig in Yorkshire could be isolated before it reached the markets of London.